Mode.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's 4 o'clock. I hope you all had a great holiday. And today we're really going to focus on evaluation and evidence-based programs. Much like last week, if you have questions throughout the presentation, just raise your hands and I'll be sure that we get to you as soon as possible. Also, there's a worksheet that you'll get attached with this one, and it's actually a sample of an evaluation section. And that was mainly because we understand that this section can be difficult to write. One thing we do recommend is that if you're interested or considering to engage an evaluator, this is one of the few times I will say it's usually a good idea if you can engage an evaluator. And it's mainly because for many proposals nowadays, the funders is usually willing to set aside even a pot of money for a fund for an evaluator for a project. Either they'll tell you to set aside a certain amount of your budget, or in some instances, they'll have an evaluator for the project themselves. If they do allow for it, then I strongly encourage you to go ahead and get an evaluator unless you have a strong background in evaluation. Usually, the evaluator can usually help you pull together this evaluation section, and it's mainly so you can be clear in terms of what you're gathering. So really today it's going to be a combination of two things. I'm going to explain to you how to write an evaluation section, but also I'm going to show you basic concepts so you can understand when you talk to the evaluator in terms of what are the best methods of collecting information and what's the best ways to present the information. So let's get right into it. The first thing we offer you is some evidence-based sites, because nowadays most funders are looking for evidence-based practices. Now, the great thing is that there are already resource hubs that have this information available to you. And as you can see, there are a number of resources available to you that have programs that have already undergone rigorous evaluation before they will let you move forward with them. Sorry, when the slides moved up. If you look at the sites available to you, the first one is the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices. For this particular site, if you're interested in doing any type of work that's involved mental health, substance abuse prevention, and substance abuse treatment, then that's the site you could look at. If you're doing any type of work with infectious diseases or HIV or STDs, then you can look at the Diffusion of Evidence-Based Interventions, or the DEBIs. If you're interested in doing any work revolving around education or improving academic performance, then What Works Clearinghouse is a good resource to consider. If you're doing any work that's dealing with juvenile delinquency, then the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention's Model Program Guide offers more than 200 tested interventions that you can use. If you're working with seniors, the Evidence-Based Disease and Disability Prevention Program. If you're looking at out-of-school time programs or after-school programs, the Harvard Family School Research Project. And if you have programs that really don't fit in, or areas that don't fit in any of those categories, you can still look at social programs that work. And again, these are resources where they've already built the programs, and when you click on those links, they'll even ask you, what's your population, what's your setting, in terms of, is it an urban setting, is it rural, is it suburban, what's the age range, what's the issue you're trying to address. And these sites will show you programs that are already developed and have been shown effective working with that population. So the great thing is you don't have to come up with a program from scratch. Now, as we talk about evaluation, the big question is, why is this section so important? Really, it's more important to you, I would even argue, than the funder, because a strong evaluation will let you know how and why you need to improve your programs. More importantly, it lets you know the data that you need to collect to demonstrate the value of your programs and to build the case for better support. So usually in a proposal, even though the evaluation section may not be the section that garners the most points, in many cases we're only talking about 5 to 10 points on most RFPs, but it's still important for you in terms of being able to show the effectiveness of your programs. And actually to kind of get us started and to get a better sense of what you currently know about evaluation, we actually have a couple of questions that we'd like to ask you in terms of what are some effective ways to evaluate and what are some methods. So we'll go ahead and start the poll. Okay, as you've seen the particular question that's asking what evaluation technique measures the implementation. Okay, for this one, if you want to understand which, in terms of how you evaluate the implementation of a program, that's actually going to be the process measure. And we'll spend some time talking about that one. So again, anytime you're looking in terms of how well a program is being implemented, and if you implemented it correctly, then you're going to look at the process measures. Okay, we'll move on to our next poll question. And this time, we're going to be looking at how do you measure the effectiveness of your programs for the participants. Okay, for this particular one, the correct answer is going to be what is outcome evaluation or summative evaluation. Now, I see a lot of folks are saying impact evaluation, and we'll talk about the slight differences between impact and outcome evaluation because there's a difference. In many instances, funders are now asking not only for outcome data, which we also call summative data, but they're also looking at impact evaluation. And I'll show you how to answer that question because that one becomes more of a trick question. All right, we'll move on to our next question. And we're looking at in terms of now we're trying to look at the difference between qualitative and quantitative data collection. Okay, for the quantitative question, if you answered program statistics, that's correct. Now we look at it in terms of what would be a qualitative method of collecting the information. And if you answered case study for this last question, you would be correct. And again, a case study is a qualitative way of answering this. And we'll spend some time talking about the different ways you can look at things quantitative and qualitatively. And I always encourage you to do a combination of both in your evaluation because it adds a richness. And we'll talk about that shortly. Okay, well, great. Thank you for answering those questions. And let's move right back into the presentation. When we look at program evaluation, really getting down to it, at the end of the day, the bottom line is just to help you make necessary decisions about your program. And you're helping the funder understand the same thing. Basically, two things you're really looking at with this. You want to see, is the program being implemented correctly? And to what extent the goals and the objectives are met. So any good evaluation section always mentions those two components. That you want to show that you're looking to determine if you're implementing the program correctly, and secondly, you want to show that whatever your program is, that it's actually meeting its goals and objectives. There's 5 types of program evaluation that you're going to be talking about. And here's one thing I want to keep in mind for you today. When we talk about this evaluation, we're not talking about research. I want to make it clear. I'm not trying to turn anyone into a researcher. As a matter of fact, I'm not even trying to turn you into an evaluator, but at least I want you to understand the available evaluation techniques and tools that are available to you, and I'll tell you how you can use any of these in your proposals. The 5 basic types we're going to talk about really are outcome evaluation, which we also call summative evaluation, impact evaluation, which is similar, and I'll give you the distinction shortly, process evaluation, which again looks at in terms of the way you implement a program, formative evaluation. You don't hear about this a lot, but I would say internally, formative evaluation is invaluable for you. And we'll talk about the difference shortly. And then finally, a cost-benefit analysis. In terms of the money that you ask for or the resources that you're expending, are you showing a good use or return, what we like to say, a return on their investment? We'll talk about that probably more so next week when we can get to the budget, because there's nothing better than when you can tell a funder, for every dollar you give us, we can turn that into $5 worth of benefit. It goes a long ways and it shows that you're in a cost-effective program. When we're talking about outcome evaluation, what we're trying to find out is whether or not the program actually caused an improvement among the participants in certain areas, and by how much. And you're basically answering these basic questions. Did your program work? And actually, as you write the narrative, that's more or less what you're saying you're trying to find out. Did your program work? And more importantly, you want to be able to describe to them why or why not the program worked. For you internally, should you continue the program? But what's more important to the funder was, as you conduct this program, was it effective to those particular participants? What can be modified? And then what evidence proves that funders should continue to spend money on your program? And these are the kind of questions you want to answer. The example I gave you, the sample we gave you, will detail what that might look like. But basically, with the outcome evaluation, the bottom line is, did your intervention or program work? And if so, you want to also be explained why or why it didn't work. Because for most funders, they want to know if they can replicate your program. And it's hard to replicate something if you don't understand how and why it works, even if the intervention is effective. So mentioning that in your evaluation section is key. A lot of you had questions about the impact evaluation. And honestly, when we look at the difference between impact and outcome evaluation looks at your participants and asks the question, Did this intervention or program work for them? Impact says, because we had an outcome with this population, there may be a larger community or area that's affected by this. We believe that because of this program, there has been a larger benefit. So basically, what it's looking at is, but actually, it sounds like it's in reverse. But what you're saying is, because of this program, something has changed in this community. For example, if I'm doing gang intervention, because we did this program in this area, some of the crime rates have begun to drop. Now, that may not have been a direct part of your program because you were working with so many youth, but as because of the behavior changes, or because they're no longer getting arrested, or they may not be committing crimes, there's a community benefit that comes out of it. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about impact. What benefits go beyond the direct scope of your program that you can say or attribute to your program? Here's a key piece about impact evaluation. When we talk about impact evaluation, we're usually talking about a correlation. Basically, it's difficult to say we're the cause of this. For example, let's go back to the example I gave to you about the gang participation. Now, the crime rate may have dropped down in the neighborhood because of my program. It also could have been, well, maybe people moved out of the neighborhood. Or it could have been individuals got locked up, they were committing the crimes, and they're no longer there. It could be a matter of folks decided, this is not the lifestyle for me. What we're basically saying is there are numerous possibilities in terms of what could have caused that to happen. With impact, the best we can say is we believe we contributed to a better outcome. And that's basically what you're trying to say. So keep in mind, when we talk about outcomes, we're generally looking at direct program participants. How does it benefit or affect them? With impact, we're looking at, once we get beyond the participants, how did the larger community or an area benefit because of this program? And again, the best you can say is we believe we have a contribution to it. And it boils down to, if you're meeting your objectives and your program is working successfully, then much like we did with the logical model, you said we can come to a logical conclusion that other folks may have benefited from this program. And that's the distinction between impact and outcome. It's really just the scale. Now, when we talk about process, now we're basically trying to determine, did this program operate the way we intended for it to operate? A good way of looking at this is, we talked last week about project and organizational capacity, and I believe you actually got a worksheet in terms of a timeline. Really, what you're looking at, if you have a timeline for the project, are you operating according to the timeline? Are you implementing the program the way you said you're going to do that? And the reason this is important to funders, if you don't operate a program or implement it correctly, it may be that the program is effective, you just didn't implement it correctly. And that's why they want you to look at both. And that's why I encourage you to look at both in your evaluation. If you said you're going to hire individuals in week 3 to run the program, did you actually hire them in week 3? If you were going to recruit 100 people by month number 2, did you get those folks in? That is important so a funder can see that you're on track. And particularly if they have dispersal times, for example, they may give you your money monthly or quarterly. They're going to want to see that you're on track before they release those funds. So having a process evaluation in place is critical, being able to show a funder we're operating exactly the way we intended to do. We're doing what we said when we said we're going to do that. And that's what a process evaluation is going to look at. A formative evaluation, now we're looking at something more internal. And the best way to look at this is, since we just had the Thanksgiving holiday, I don't know how many of you cooked dinner for Thanksgiving, but here's something to consider. If you're making any type of dish, you're not going to generally just follow a recipe and just put it out there. You're generally going to taste test along the way to make sure it's right. Do I need to add more salt? Do I need to add other seasoning? Whatever it may be. But you're just going to test along the way to make sure it's the way it's supposed to be. Well, that's what formative evaluation is for a program for an agency. It just lets you know, is the program becoming effective as you're implementing it? As the activities are forming or happening, are things going effectively? Here's a good way to look at it. You may have started in the initial parts of your program. You may have done a couple of sessions of your program. Finding out from the participants, do they understand what's going on? Are they getting the materials? Are they becoming more effective, whatever change you're trying to make happen in them? This allows you to more or less tweak along the way. A formative evaluation just says, I think things are working right. We're going to check in with the participants, whether it's a survey, a focus group, or just to randomly pull case files just to see if things are operating like you think they were. It's slightly different from a process evaluation because a process evaluation is only looking at, are we implementing this correctly? A formative evaluation will also look at, are we beginning to see some benefits and some changes? If you think about the logic model, now we're starting to look at some of the short-term pieces. Are we starting to see these short-term measures? Are they occurring? Because if they're not, we can make an adjustment in month number 2 or 3. We don't want to wait to month number 8 or 9 to realize things aren't happening the way we thought they would. So again, while every funder doesn't ask for this, they see you as a savvy organization when you put some type of formative evaluation measure in its place, because they know that you're constantly checking with your program to make sure that not only are you on task and on time with the process evaluation, but also that you are beginning to show effectiveness early on. And if you're not, then you're beginning to make the adjustments to your program necessary to get the outcomes you're looking for. If you're going to do this, then keep in mind that a formative evaluation is going to happen more than once. It's just like any other taste test. We're going to do it a couple of times. I would say usually monthly or at the bare minimum quarterly, just to make sure you're on track. Because again, if you get too far down the road, it's hard to come back. When we look at cost benefit, it's just a matter of, we looked at that square in the logic model, which was the input. In terms of the resources that I have, how well am I using them? If you give me cash funding, then how much is that benefit worth? This particularly works well if you're looking at governmental funders. When they can see that you can leverage their dollars, and for every dollar you save the federal government or the county or the district or the state, let's say for every dollar they give, you save the state $5. That's the kind of piece that makes it easy, particularly when you get to your organizational capacity section, to argue that the program has merit and that you're a good steward of their resources. Another unintended effect is, this is something you can also place on your website for donors to see as well. This one, a lot of funders are not going to ask for it. But again, if you've got the other process and outcome measures solid, then it never hurts to put this out there. And again, it just asks, are you using those resources to their optimal benefit? When we're looking at the evaluation model, and this is pretty much how you would write the section, it really starts out with asking, what are the questions that you want to know? And basically stating to the funder, as we implement this evaluation, we're trying to find out these questions. Then it's just a matter of showing them how you're going to collect the data, how you plan on analyzing, and then how you report it out. Now, in terms of the fifth measure, that's just a matter of saying, once we have this, here's what we're going to do with the data moving forward. So it may be program data. We're saying we'll use this to improve the program, or we'll share this information with this community so they can make choices about what they want, how they want to move forward. But basically, every evaluation section should have sections that answer these questions. And usually, you only have about a page or so for the section. So again, you want to be succinct. And this is also a great time if you need to bullet some of these things. But again, what questions do you want to answer? How do you plan on collecting it? How and who is going to analyze the data? How will you draft that report, and who will that report be available to? And then what decisions will you make based on the information that you didn't have before? And this is a pretty good method of writing the evaluation section. If you look at the sample that we're giving you pretty much follows this method. We're trying to define the question. Again, here's some basic things you can ask them. What needs are you trying to address? How are these needs best identified? You kind of know who your targeted audience is, but how can you begin to show what type of improvements are you expecting to see in the target audience? Why are you doing this evaluation in the first place? And more importantly, who needs this piece? And again, if you look at your logic model and your goals and objectives, if you did a good job of developing the logic model, and you wrote clear, concise objectives and goals, then basically the evaluation section is just answering how are you going to answer those questions. How are you going to address all the components of your logic model under the short, medium, and long-range goals? And more importantly, how you will ensure that those goals and objectives you listed will be answered. In terms of the data collection method, again, it just boils down to what you're trying to accomplish. Again, the goals, objective, and indicators, and most of these are things that you saw in your logic model. So your indicators, as you remember, that's the evidence in terms of how you're going to accomplish your objectives. For example, if I'm saying I want to do an academic improvement program, then one of the questions may be, what would be an indicator for that? Well, is their GPA improving? Are the test scores going up? These are indicators. And that's exactly what I would collect. I would collect their report cards. I get a report of their test scores. And these are concrete things you can use in terms of what data you need to collect. That's just an example. The indicators, a lot of things we talked about before. And again, if you keep in mind the logic model session, the indicators are, again, the things you're looking for to prove that your outcomes are moving forward. If you're trying to show that a student is not truant, you may want to say, my indicator is I look at their attendance records, or I look at do they come to class on time. Basically, an indicator is your concrete proof. It's your evidence. And as long as you can come up with an indicator for anything you're looking for, you're going to be in good shape. Again, if you're unclear, it's not a bad time to talk to an evaluator or someone who has some background in program evaluation. But the bottom line is, all you have to ask yourself is, what is the hard evidence I would need to prove that something is happening? In terms of data sources, again, these are just places that you can go to make sure that there's been a change in a skill, knowledge, or behavior. And it can be objective, subjective, quantitative, or qualitative. When it's objective, we're basically talking it's being assessed through a test. There's not much, I hate to use the word, subjectivity in it. It's a hard, cold fact. While a subjective source tends to be more of an opinion, or if a program has affected me, I'm telling you how I believe this program has affected me or benefited me. It's not necessarily objective. And here's the difference between the two. If you ask me how well I read, I can tell you, I think I read pretty well. That would be subjective. But if you gave me a reading assessment score test, then regardless of how I felt, that test is going to determine a raw score that I'm going to get. Now, why we used to say to use a combination of the two, the objective sources tend to just give you the hard, cold facts. But the subjective sources tend to offer an explanation behind it. A lot of times I say it's the true Hollywood story. The objective sources will tell you what's happening, but a lot of times including subjective sources tends to help you understand why from the perspective of the participants or the perspective of other folks that come into contact with the participants. For example, if you have a child in the classroom, a standardized test can tell you how well they read or write or what their math level is. But a subjective report from a teacher can also tell you, well, here's how they're performing. Here's what I see. Here's what they're doing. And you may not capture that in an objective source. When we're talking about quantitative, again, we're talking percentages, numbers, statistics. But when we're talking about qualitative sources, this way, again, we're looking at observations or other folks reporting. Again, if the teacher reported about a student's behavior. Really, which one you use all depends on what you're measuring and how available those sources are to you. For example, if I run an after-school program, I may, and it's small, I may be able to say I know all the students, I can have a subjective report. If this intervention is happening with hundreds of individuals, they may not know every individual, so you may need an objective source such as a test to make it happen. But you have options available to you. When we look at qualitative and quantitative, and this is not an exhaustive list, but again, it's just to give you an idea. And what we'll do as well is we'll send you a list of other data collection options and the pros and cons that go with them. If we're talking about qualitative information, then again, this is information that we're collecting that's expressed in words. And these tend to be open-ended questions, which is basically any question that's not a yes or no question or choose A, B, or C. It's basically asking a question such as, what do you think about this? Or how does the program improve your life? And the folks just answer whatever comes to them. You can also look at focus groups. And that's just an opportunity for folks to just talk about, again, about an issue or the impact of a program. With a case study, that's choosing a couple people in your program and following them specifically. Now, while this doesn't give you the full picture of the entire program, what it does is it personalizes the intervention. This works particularly well with donors, and I would actually say there are some foundations that love to see the story. Because if you think about it, they see a number of stats, and stats are important. But when you can personalize your program in such a way as, here's one particular participant that was affected by our program, and we're going to show you how we plan on collecting that. Again, it just adds a richness to your evaluation section. With the quantitative, again, these are things that are expressed in numbers or statistics. You can look at attendance records. You can develop a survey. You develop a questionnaire. Or you can even look at stats. And these may be stats collected by places such as the health department or collected by the police department. And again, this is just information that's readily available and you can use to see if there's an actual change in the population or the area that you're working with. Some other data source examples, you can use pre and post-test scores. And again, most evaluation sections, they usually say, we're going to do a pre-test, post-test. I'm letting you know from the point of reviewers and funders, that's not cutting it by itself anymore. While the pre and post-test is useful, it has limitations. And honestly, if you don't do it correctly, a pre-test, post-test can come back to bite you. And I'm going to give you a quick example to show you that and why you also want to include other methods besides only a pre and post test. A pre-test, basically, the whole idea is you ask questions on the front end before the intervention begins, and you establish what we call a baseline, or where everybody's at. Then you follow up somewhere down the road and do a post-test, and you can compare the difference. And ideally, the person should be better by the post-test than they were from the pre-test. The only issue you run into is when a participant is either over or underconfident about what they think they know. And let's use this grant writing class as an example. If there was a pretest established and someone asked you the question on this pretest, how well do you understand proposal writing? Or an example of this evaluation class, how well do you understand evaluation? You may go into it saying, I understand evaluation incredibly well. Or, excuse me, I really don't understand evaluation that well. Then as we go through the information, you realize, oh, wow, I actually know more than I thought I did. Well, by the time we do a post-test and we ask the question, how much did you learn? Well, you may say, not a lot. And it's only because you knew more than you thought you did. But from a programmatic standpoint, it looks like a failure on the part of the program because the pre and post test didn't show a lot of change. And the only issue was the folks in the beginning knew more than they thought they did. It also works in reverse, where you can have individuals that are overconfident about their skills or overconfident about their success. And again, you do the intervention and they see this big shift in the scores. And it's not because of your intervention, it's just because the pre-test was skewed. So that's what we say. even if you have a pre and a post test, to offer some other evaluation method. Otherwise, you take the chance of having bad data. Funders recognize that now, particularly on the governmental side and particularly on the federal side. So please keep in mind, while the pre and post test is an effective method, it's not the only method, and you'll usually need to back that up with something else. And that could be an interview, surveys, and again, it can be open or closed-ended. Open, we just ask open questions, or closed-ended, we give them choices or a Likert scale. They can do self-report. You can look at program records. You can look at records in terms of law enforcement, health, or social services, and you can even do observations. In terms of analyzing the data, you only want to be able to tell the funder how often are you going to do this? When will you look at the data? Who will be looking at the data? And what type of recurrent things would you be looking for? When and how would you compare against your baseline data? And you want to talk to them about how the data relates to your indicators and your final program outcomes. Again, that section is just detailing these parts right here. And one of the things you always want to mention again is what type of themes are you looking for and how frequently will you review the data and who will do so. That's key. In terms of using this part, and here's one of the things I want to emphasize to you. Evaluation tends to be the section that most people do not like to do. And one of the things I really want to impress upon you is that this section, I always said you should be able to use it as an offensive weapon. You want to be able to show funders in terms of the cost savings. It really becomes the key to all your fund development, your marketing, as well as setting agendas down the road. And a tool for staff development, because as you evaluate, you realize, are there some things my staff needs to improve upon? Are there some areas that we can improve the program if I train my staff better? So there's a number of things that come out of a good evaluation section. And a lot of times we'll mention these things to funders because as we cost save, whether it's a cost benefit analysis or we realize ways to be more effective, then I'm saving the funder money in the long run. In terms of my fund development, I can use this information as I meet with donors and other funders. So when we talk about sustainability, I always talk about how I'm going to leverage my evaluation findings and use that, particularly dealing with donors. With the marketing piece, again, as we always talk about how we're going to report out, and if particularly if we have strong programmatic outcomes, and this is if you're dealing with any type of foundation, but particularly corporate foundations, then I show how we will share this information with other key stakeholders that may be interested in this as well. We'll also use in terms of setting the agenda on funding and priorities. What I mean by that is, a lot of times as you do the evaluation, you're finding out information before the funders may have be privy to it. So we share with them on a regular basis so they can realize how to make adjustments. And I can think of numerous times when we've done a program and we realize we may have been targeting one particular group, but then we realize there's another vulnerable population that no one had been considering. Or we realize there's a gap in services. And that's the kind of things you can take to a funder, whether it's foundations, district, or federal, and share with them, and particularly work with them to shift some funding priorities. And since you're the ones that tend to find these areas, you're in the prime position to benefit from this if the funder actually begins to changes. And we always talk about how we use evaluation for staff development in terms of what does my staff need to know? How can I share this with them so they can become better at what they do? And funders love to see that as well. So even though most funders don't request this part, I usually put it in because it separates us from other sections that usually only talk about the pre-test or post-test. We talk about what we're going to collect, how we're going to collect it, who's going to collect it, what we're going to do with it, the benefit, and more importantly, how this is critical to what we do as an organization in terms of being cost-effective and having great outcomes. When we talk about the reporting parts, there's usually only 3 things we mention in this section. And that's basically what do we want to do, what do we actually do, and what will be the impact of the next steps, or what we call the so whats. And again, we just mentioned basically we're going to report on these things, and we mentioned how. In terms of the evaluation reporting, if you look at it, the reporting goes in key areas, and it lines up with your logic model. Again, we always report out in terms of what do we use. So if we want to do a cost benefit, how much do we spend? How much did we use, and who did we use in terms of partners or volunteers, or how much staff time did it actually take? What did we do? What did we produce? Who received the activities, and what was the benefit? And again, if you combine all these points we mentioned into this section, you're generally going to get the maximum points and use that sample as a tool to help you format it out. Okay, we've reached the end of this presentation. Are there any questions? If you have questions, raise your hands or just put the question in chat and we'll get to them as soon as possible. Okay, we have a question from Evelyn Turner.
How much of your budget should you allocate for an evaluator?
In many instances, in the RFP, the funder is going to let you know how much you can set aside.
Okay.
I would generally say it depends on the size of your budget, but for
Okay.
most evaluators, you're going to need, if it's a small program, then we're talking about $3,500 to $5,000 set aside. As the program
Okay.
becomes larger, I would tell for most places you're not going to spend more than $10,000 to $15,000 unless it's a larger program that's much more complex. But a lot of times, as you talk to the evaluator, you can basically tell them, here's what I need to know, and they will often give you a quote or estimate. But that's the ballpark you're looking at.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure thing. Okay. There's a question from Rachel Dutcher. Okay, Rachel, are you there? Okay, then we're going to move on. And Rachel, if you have a question, you come back, feel free. We're going to move on to Kurt Stand. Okay, I'm not sure if you have muted your mics or not, or if your mics are not working. If for some reason you can't seem to get through with the question, then you may be able to just write it in a chat, and we'll still be able to answer your question. Okay, we have Mason the team.
Hello,
Hello, and I'm sorry, did I get your name correct?
Mason, yeah.
Okay, and what's your question?
My last question is about the data aggregation.
You said about the obligation?
Data aggregation, yeah.
Okay, the debt obligation.
Yeah.
Now what's the question concerning debt obligation?
What is that exactly and how I can measure it?
Okay, the debt obligation. What type of program are you trying to do?
I'm working HIV and AIDS unit in monitoring and evaluation program.
Okay, so you work as an HIV AIDS program.
Yeah.
And you said you're looking at the debt obligation?
Aggregation, yeah.
Okay, because I'm trying to make sure I'm clear on what you're asking, because a lot of times when we talk about debt obligation, we're talking more financials. And I want to make sure that I'm, at least the mic on my end, that I'm hearing correctly what you're asking for. Give me a better sense in terms of what you're looking at with the program. If you can give me an example, I may be able to answer it a little bit better.
But if I have like many data and I wanted to aggregate them like quarterly, for example.
Okay. It broke up a little bit because I'm sorry to make you repeat it, but again, the objectives on the data collection, is that the same as process evaluation?
Yeah.
Um, when we look at the objectives really are more toward your outcome evaluation. When we talk about process evaluation, it's really if you have a work plan or a timeline. For example, some funders will say in the first quarter, what will you accomplish? And it's usually going to be things such as we'll have this many people hired, we'll have this many people recruited, this many people will begin to attend our sessions. You're not necessarily looking at an outcome, but you're just saying that our program is operating. So in the case of in the HIV program, it may be a matter of this many people are getting tested, or it may be a question of this many people are receiving information. It's basically just showing that your program is on track. So it's slightly different. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
All right. Are there other questions? Okay. Um, Asking one final time, are there any last questions that you may have, whether it is in raising your hands and typing them in chat, or if there's a question you just like to ask? Okay, then. In that case, I will take that as a no, and we'll go ahead and conclude our session. And I want to thank you all for your participation today. Next week, we're going to be talking about budgeting. And in preparation for that, we're going to send you the sample budget, and we'll probably get it to you a little bit sooner. And it's mainly so you'll have an opportunity to play around with that budget. That particular budget form will already have the categories in it, and the calculations and the formulas will already be in it. So all you have to do is add your numbers. And if a funder doesn't give you a budget form to use, it's going to be a pretty good one that you can work with. So we're going to give it to you just a little bit earlier so you can do so. And I see we have a couple of questions still coming in. So we'll go ahead and take these additional questions.
Hi, Lydia. You can go ahead and ask your question now. Hello, Lydia.
Okay, the question that came up, how do you get the worksheets? Generally, any forms that we send the workshops are going to be available through the OPGS website. So you should get with this one, with this presentation, and you also get the recording of this presentation as well. There will be worksheets that you can download. And for this particular one, it's a sample evaluation section. It's already been written out, and it's a format that you can pretty much follow that will help you out. As a matter of fact, if you go to the website for OPGS tomorrow, you should see it posted at that point in time. Okay, other questions? Okay, there's no more questions. So again, we'll try to make sure this budget information is just there a little bit earlier for you. And we look forward to talking with you during our last section next week. Take care, and we'll talk to you then.